Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Today we are at our penultimate lecture on the book Seeking Wisdom by Sri Ram. Next week, as Carol mentioned, we will see the elixir of life, which, although the title speaks of life, the chapter is above all about death. It is a very interesting approach by a master of great stature who explains it in a way that aims to foster serenity in relation to death, to remove the fear of death. That is his goal with this chapter. And, well, at least for me, it worked very well. I always find his approach very appropriate. And I remind you that in January of next year, we will begin another book, which is the Kybalion. We will see chapter by chapter, and you are all already invited in advance. Well, today, chapter 14 is called The Three Paths in One. And its purpose, I always like to give you a brief summary so you have a central idea, is not only in this book, but in other works by Sri Ram. He says that in the Eastern tradition, the person who sought wisdom, that the pursuit of wisdom was like a pyramid. At first, at the base of the pyramid, you ascend by different phases. As you ascend, you narrow toward a single point. So, remember this. We have spoken about it to those who have attended other lectures for the Eastern tradition, and very much for the classical Western tradition as well, such as Plato and Aristotle. Human beings move from ignorance toward wisdom, and this is the meaning of life. Necessarily, we must walk the path toward wisdom. It is not a matter of choice or preference. This is what is expected of human beings, just as nature expects photosynthesis from plants, survival from animals, and inertia from minerals. From humanity, it expects wisdom. So, human evolution, human development, developing, unfolding, bringing forth what lies in potential within oneself, is the gradual attainment of wisdom as time moves forward, so that you may leave behind clock time and enter real time. Clock time, the time of Chronos, becomes the time of God, eternity. When a person moves beyond mere survival and enters a dimension of human growth, of humanization, then they have entered a dimension of real time, of Olympus. In fact, for those who do not know, the very word Olympus comes from elimbus vonus, what has emerged from the limbo of unconsciousness, of ignorance, what has risen from obscurity. In other words, it is very classical. It is said that if you were to ask a Greek or Roman man what, for example, ethics was, he would tell you to ascend to Olympus. Ethics or morality, depending on the language you are using, he would tell you, to ascend to Olympus to reach the dwelling place of the gods. This symbolically means to reach the pure essence of humanity, that is, the possession of values, virtues, and wisdom. And Sri Ram says then that this pyramid begins with many faces according to the nature of each person. Further ahead, everything merges together. But in general, these many faces are synthesized into three, which are the three initial paths. These are wisdom, action, and devotion. He says they are very similar, but in essence, it is all the same thing. I agree, it is all the same thing. But when a person is at the base, just beginning to grow, there is a slight differentiation in the path, which for them is more understandable and more suitable at the beginning. So he will explain basically what these three words mean. Nowadays, we are curious. We love to analyze our own personalities. So when we say there are so many categories, everyone gets curious. I don't exclude myself from this. Everyone wants to know which one is theirs. My horoscope, my temperament, mine. Well, as with everything in the world of senses, it is healthy to have a curiosity for self-knowledge, yes. But I think it can be a bit exaggerated. We have an excess of curiosity about our personality and very little curiosity directed toward our inner life, toward a deeper being. We are overly curious about the traits of our personality and have very little curiosity about what we are in essence. But in any case, as Sri Ram says, he is a philosopher. You may have heard a bit about him. I always explain this in my lectures. A 20th century philosopher who was in Rio in 1973. He was Indian, though not a devotee of any Indian religion, a philosopher. And so he addresses these three paths which are proposed by the Eastern tradition. So let us proceed. We will see what he has to say on this subject. Indian philosophy, three paths, wisdom, action, and devotion. He will say that they are like three types of yoga or understanding with not very clear separation. Always remembering that when he talks about yoga, he is talking about yug, bond, reunion, gather. Reunite is a very appropriate name because it was once united. He is finding himself again. Returning to find the essence and the appearance, the being and the shadow, the meeting of heaven and earth. He says that yoga has a meaning very similar to religare, which gave rise to religio religare, which gave rise to the word religion. It is a reunion between heaven and earth, between essence and appearance, when the being comes to have its shadow at its service, when the two are not turned against each other, but there is a meeting, which would be more or less the meaning of that position we so often use when praying. The meeting of essence and appearance, the manifestation. So he goes on to say that yoga, like many other words from the Eastern tradition, when it arrives in the West, becomes emptied and is taken in a very superficial way. Because it is a language, a set of symbols created for the psyche of an Eastern person from a certain temporal context. And when you apply this to the West, the Westerner says they are anxious, in a hurry, wanting very concise, very quick explanations, and to get rid of it as fast as possible. And Eastern concepts were not made to be understood this way. They were, in general, ideograms. An ideogram carried a multitude of meanings. The Westerner goes crazy with this. They want a single, simple, palatable meaning to absorb and quickly move on to another subject. And when you take Eastern concepts like Dharma, like karma, like yoga, and try to assign just one meaning, nirvana, for example, they say it is a negation. What is said about nirvana in the West? It is said that nirvana is nothingness. The last thing nirvana is, for the East, is nothingness. Can you imagine a Buddha striving to attain wisdom only to arrive at nothingness? This is a Western interpretation that leads to a series of misunderstandings because it gives rise to materialism. If nothing comes after life, why will I make an effort to become a better person? So he says, be careful with the concepts of yoga, karma, dharma, nirvana, nidana, and many other words that have been brought from Sanskrit into Neo-Latin and Anglo-Saxon languages, or whichever language, with a greatly reduced meaning. It is better to say, I don't know, and set it aside, and continue working with more accessible Western terms, or undertake a more thorough study. So this would be the idea of yoga, and these would be the three paths to follow it. The Bhagavad Gita, as it says, has 18 chapters. Practically, each chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is a yoga. It is a path for a person to perceive the meeting of their Arjuna essence, to encounter Krishna, which is spirit and matter, being and appearance. The Bhagavad Gita, for those who are not familiar, is a great Indian classic which holds sacred significance for them, much like the Bible does for Christians or the Quran for Muslims. And today, it is a book that is increasingly gaining importance across all corners of the world. So, the Bhagavad Gita has 18 chapters. It is said that each of the 18 chapters represents a different type of yoga. So, it is difficult to say whether there are 3, 10, or 1,000 paths. Each human being, with their own uniqueness, will begin in their own way. It is said that these 1,000 ways could be synthesized into 3. Ultimately, there are 3 main channels. These are the channels through which a person ascends. All virtues are necessary. Therefore, it is natural that, further along the journey, the paths will merge. Well, he will now begin to speak about the path of action. Karma Yoga in the Indian tradition. Karma Yoga is the path of right action. Imagine, once again, how complicated it is to talk about this. For Westerners, it is about rectitude. What is rectitude? We are accustomed to an ethic of coercion rather than one of conviction. Rectitude is an element that holds much more meaning for oneself than as a mere social convention. You do not act out of pressure. You act because you feel a genuine need for it. Buddha worked with the idea of rectitude as a path to overcoming suffering. Thus, rectitude is an action that finds its meaning and foundation in the fulfillment of the human being as such, and not simply conforming to social conventions. I have recounted this many times. My students often joke about that famous line from Roberto Carlos, "Is everything I like illegal, immoral, or fattening?" In other words, I am drawn to everything that is not upright. But since this brings about social sanctions, I am upright. I do not have a love for rectitude. I do not even understand what that is. It is said that Thales of Miletus, perhaps you have heard of this philosopher, once, in his time, was walking down the street and came across a group of mathematicians who were working on a calculation. And he supposedly asked them, "What are you searching for?" And they replied, "We are trying to define the straight line." Geometrically, what is a straight line? And he is said to have answered these men, What is the point of knowing what a straight line is if you no longer remember what rectitude is? When you separate technical knowledge from human understanding, you end up handling things in a utilitarian and selfish way. And you will never truly understand what rectitude is. But what purpose does it serve for you? Rectitude, either you understand it in all its. There are applications in the physical, metaphysical, psychological, and spiritual realms where you do not know what rectitude is, you only know how to use it. This is the world of utilitarianism, the world of know-how. So, he will say that when action is superficial, it is generally a chaotic movement. Imagine this person with all these footprints. We experience alienation. We call the successful man, the efficient man, the stressed one, the one who does many things. He does many things, and when you look, the marks he left on the world are like this. In circles, on the sand. In other words, soon the wind will blow, carry away all that sand, and nothing will remain. It is not an action aligned with a greater purpose, nor is it founded on anything more solid than sand. In other words, the person who truly led an active life is not the one who did many things, but the one who did the right things in the right direction. In the direction of overcoming one's flaws and achieving progressive wisdom, self-knowledge, self-mastery, and self-transformation, which is what medieval alchemy referred to as the work in black, the work in white, and the work in red. In other words, steps that are purposeful, ascending, and aligned, built on a foundation more solid than mere sand. That would be to act. So, doing many things is sometimes just going in circles. And there comes a certain moment when this person stops and looks at all the marks they have left, some of which must already be fading, if not almost all, and says, I did nothing. A terrible stress, a frantic rush, and then comes the feeling of victimization. How unfair the world has been to me, because I ran so much, hardly rested at all. I did 1,000 things and have nothing to show for it. Well, the world was not unfair to you. The world gave you the fruit of what you planted. In other words, a superficial action yields superficial, temporary results. One of the things where you can see this very clearly, a phenomenon unfortunately all too common, is something called fame. In our historical moment, one of the things people desire most is social projection, fame. Have you ever seen anything more disposable? And more cruel when it fades away, as people generally believe that it holds some value, that it is imbued with some worth. And they are quickly forgotten with the same speed with which they were remembered and celebrated. Hollywood actors, once they reach a certain age, singers, artists in general from the so-called pop world, with the same swiftness with which they were promoted, they become utterly forgotten. Have you ever noticed how these people react to this? How they sometimes die? Sometimes they believe there was something real there. Each of us has our own moment of disappointment because we all have our fair share of actions. Useless, superficial actions where we look back and see that we accomplished nothing. And then one might say, well, the yoga of action, when not understood, will give rise to this kind of phenomenon, going in circles, which only leads to exhaustion and lack of motivation. That person who, at a certain age, which even has a social label, like the midlife crisis, the crisis at 50, which can vary, sometimes from 45 to 55, 60. At some point, the individual stops and says, my life was worth nothing. This is very common. It has even been given the name of a pathology, so common is it in society. At some point, they look back, reflect, and say it was all for nothing. Then comes that false impression that it is already too late to start doing something truly meaningful. Yet the moment of realization is an immensely valuable one, because it gives you the opportunity to begin taking life seriously and to do things that are truly worthwhile, no matter when that moment arrives. Even if it happens just hours before the end of this experience, it is still worthwhile. The worst thing of all is to never reach this revelation, to never come to this realization. Do you understand what I am saying? Let me give a very simple and straightforward example. There is a course I taught some time ago, which is even available on the internet, called How to Overcome Your Inner Limits, where an author named Stephen Pressfield, who is an excellent writer, said the following: "I wrote for years on end, and only my friends read my work, and my mother. Everyone thought everything was wonderful, of course. My friends and my mother, obviously they were going to think it was wonderful. Then, one day, I wrote a movie script that was accepted by the film industry and they made the movie. It was a terrible, dreadful failure. It was a complete flop. Then I was talking to a friend and he asked, 'Are you going to get discouraged?' And he said, 'No. I had a failure, but at least it was a failure in the real world. I left the imaginary world, where only my friends and my mother evaluated me. Now, I am in the arena. I experienced failure, but it was a failure in the real world. So now, things are serious. Now, it truly matters.' So, the moment we realize that our actions were not well-founded has been considered sacred in many civilizations. They called it a kind of initiation, a rebirth, an awakening of consciousness. It should be celebrated, not mourned. Now, it is time for us to step into the arena and begin to truly act in the real world. Welcome to the real world. A real world with real time, not just illusory time, and illusory achievements. So, he says that it is very difficult for a person, in proportion to their level of superficiality, materialism, and alienation, not to reach this point. Of looking back, exhausted and unmotivated, what he will do, from then on, is that it will set the tone for whether your life will be valid or not. Whether this experience will exhaust him or renew his spirit to start all over again, now, in the right way. It can have both effects. Selfish action, lifeless and without results, maintained by a feeling of self-importance, ends in demotivation. And it's good that it ends. It means that a cycle of your life has come to an end. That, in this way, it will no longer work. You will have to start over with a different motivation. Or perhaps you will not start over. And then, what will you do? You must create another motivation. Perhaps better, probably better. If you have gained maturity from this experience, you will have to start again with a better motivation. Or not, you start over. On one occasion, there was a discussion about Sri Ram himself. He was asked, well, what about a great executive, a person who has achieved great success in the world? Materially, someone with a lot of discipline, great work capacity, and much efficiency. In what they do, isn't that true? It is true. And, since he believed in reincarnation and worked within the Indian tradition, I am not here to present this as an absolute truth, but simply to share with you what he answered, what he thought. This person asked, well, an executive who possesses these virtues, let's say he reincarnates, will he begin with the virtues he has acquired, and if he becomes a spiritualist, will he be a powerhouse? Then he would say, be careful, no. Because when you change your motivation, all the energy that was invested in that previous motivation for this new one will have to be completely recreated. Do you understand? Because for one motivation, a person can move mountains and seas, but for the other, not so. This motivation will have to be entirely rebuilt from scratch. It's as if you were to take, right now, a man who is highly motivated by something that brings him money and say, for the good of humanity. Imagination, creativity, initiative, boldness, everything resets to zero. And he will have to rebuild all these faculties, these virtues, in order to work for that reason. Do you see? So, at some point in this life or another, according to him, according to this tradition, one will have to reset one motivation and move on to another. To move from an earthly motivation, very material, tied purely to survival, which is more animal than human, and transition to a more celestial motivation. I remember that Professor Michel Echenique, who brought New Acropolis to Brazil, came from Chile, worked there, and was a person who had a structured life. In Chile, he was Chilean. And when he came to Brazil to open New Acropolis here, he came alongside a person who was an executive coming to open a branch of his company in Brazil. He used to tell us this story, and I found it very amusing. He has already passed away a few years ago. He used to say, look, this gentleman spent hours telling me how good his business was and how he was going to make a lot of money in Brazil. Then, after a while, he asked me, "And you, what are you going to do in Brazil?" "Ah, I will do a school of philosophy." "A school of philosophy? But does that make money?" So he decided to play a little joke on this man. "It does. I don't know how many $1,000 a month." "Wow, that's a good business. Don't you want to let me get into this business with you? Won't you accept a partner?" In other words, philosophy was absolutely uninteresting just 5 minutes ago. Now it was already a good business. Do you know why? Does it make money? Is it profitable? That is, the interest and motivation are all focused on having, not on being. And shifting between these two focuses is not something simple. No matter how painful it may be, if the exhaustion of an experience allows you to create a new motivation for life, it was not too costly. It was well worth it. It was worth it. Do you understand? No matter how painful it may be, the exhaustion of a life cycle, the exhaustion of a project, if it allows you to start anew, thinking less about yourself, with less selfishness, with less vanity, it was not expensive. It was a fair price. It was worth it. Because it will give you a completely new perspective on life, as if it were a rebirth. This, for him, is a form of resurrection and rebirth. In fact, he will speak a lot about this in chapter 15. And this, for him, would be the transmutation, the transfiguration spoken of in the Christian tradition. The human being is now reborn with a human purpose. And what if this happens? Even if it happens just hours before his death, it was still worthwhile, because at least you achieved that degree of awareness, even if only for a few hours of consciousness. It is possible for a human being to live an entire life without having a single hour of true human consciousness. And the value of your life is measured by real time, that is, the time spent in human consciousness. So, superficial and vain objectives, those tied merely to the projection of the small self. A life without significance, a banal existence. Remember what we spoke about for those who were here last week. The great art of humanity is to steal moments from time for eternity. To steal moments from banality and elevate them to the sacred, to the purpose of giving meaning. Because the purpose of giving meaning to life is to be human in the fullness of the human condition. BG refers to the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita teaches that action performed with enthusiasm and intensity, without desiring anything for oneself, is extremely rare. Consider this. The Bhagavad Gita is a book that was written millennia ago, in a cultural context very different from our own, in India. In other words, even at that time, it was already very rare for a person to act without selfishness and without personal interests. It has always been this way. Humanity has been searching for this for a very long time, and it will probably continue searching for it for a long time to come. We cannot think that we will achieve this tomorrow, because such expectation will only bring us more discouragement and more disappointment. It is a slow path of transformation, step by step. And it is said that when you explain to people that right action is action performed out of duty, this often leads to yet another misunderstanding typical of the West. Because duty is something that is viewed very negatively nowadays. Duty is often seen as synonymous with obligation, generally an obligation imposed from the outside in, highly unpleasant and carried out with a good dose of bitterness, with reluctance, a bitter necessity. Duty is not obligation in the pejorative sense. Duty is fulfillment. It is doing that which brings you a sense of wholeness, that which grants you peace of mind, that which allows you to move forward. A step toward your ideal. And duty requires no other interest than self-fulfillment, for it brings to a person a reward that nothing and no one can take away. This is the meaning of the Eastern concept of detachment. I don't know if any of you have ever read the Bhagavad Gita, which is a wonderful book, truly worth reading, where this idea of detachment is very well explained. Imagine that you have to make a decision right now. What considerations would you need to make? What does nature expect of me as a human being? Nature expects me to be just, and to be just in this context is to do this. So I do it. And what do I expect from this action? To be human. What do I expect from this action? To fulfill myself as a human being. What I will gain, what I will lose with this, well, that is irrelevant. It does not depend on me. whether people like me or not, because I am just depends more on them than on me. What depends on me is to be just. A plant, in order to perform photosynthesis, will not ask the audience if they want it or if they like it. I have told you many times about the tomato plant that sprouted in the back of my yard, which was a wonderful thing. Nature gives us a lesson with this. It never asked me if I deserved its tomatoes. For those who are interested, I have a blog of chronicles. I wrote a chronicle about the tomato plant because I found its act of generosity so beautiful, even though it was already all dried up. And still, with its last branch, it offered, as if it were an outstretched hand, 3 little tomatoes. Like every philosopher, I write about everything and value these small things. I found this moment very beautiful and wrote a chronicle about it. As I have said many times, I think some of you already know this example. But what I want to say with this example is that nature does not ask if you deserve its tomatoes, its apples. It gives. Why? Because that is its nature. It is a tomato plant. It is an apple tree. It does not check external factors. It simply does what is natural to it. And it is happy being what it is meant to be. According to this philosophical tradition, which Sri Ram upholds, a tradition not only of the East, but as I have already mentioned to you, one that coincides with the classical thought of the West as well, each being fulfills itself by being what it truly is. Happiness comes from aligning yourself with what nature expects of you. Thus, he will say that action performed out of duty is an action imbued with love, which is self-sufficient. It expects absolutely nothing in return. It has reached such a point that some traditions, when describing detachment, say that a person who acts with detachment does not expect salvation, does not expect merit, neither in heaven nor on earth. There is a story from the Sufi tradition, which is the essence of Islam. It is said that there was a Sufi sheikh, who was a great master, very wise. He was riding a camel on a mountain, and ahead of him was another camel with another traveler. Suddenly, this camel became frightened and threw the traveler down the ravine. And he clings to a fragile branch and hangs there, calling for help. And this master who was coming behind him gathered everything he could, clothes, branches, anything, to try to rescue the man who was hanging over the abyss. And it is said that, at that moment, the heavens suddenly opened and the angel Gabriel appeared, an authority within this tradition, and said, "Look, you have already demonstrated fraternity, generosity, and kindness. The path of the earth is now complete for you. Come with me, the heavens have opened for you." And it is said that this man looks at the mountain, at the traveler who was still hanging there, and then looks at the angel. Gabriel, he calls the angel Gabriel and says to him, "Come here. Can't I trade heaven for a good piece of rope?" Do you know what this means? What matters to me right now? To be human. And to be human, do I need rope or heaven? Rope. So now, I do what is my duty, and then I will see where I will go, wherever is necessary, wherever my human condition leads me. But neither heaven nor earth can take away his intention to be human. Now, this is action out of duty. Infused with love, love for our very human condition, which is dignity. Love for humanity as a whole, which is compassion, which is fraternity. This would be the idea of retention. It is not a bitter or burdensome obligation. It is the fulfillment of being what corresponds to us within the scheme of nature. He says that this is the path of action, karma yoga. It is fulfilled within oneself. One does not wait for their action to succeed or fail. That does not depend on them. What depends on them is to do what corresponds to them. Theirs is the beautiful, free action, performed with love and with their whole being. Action includes thinking, reflecting, seeing, and listening. With love, we reach a higher point of sensitivity and fulfillment. He says that love ensures that, in action, all your potential is brought to its highest level. With love, your action is infused with the utmost of your possibilities. The prayers that monks used to recite in the tradition. Buddhists would say, may I give the best of myself, and may tomorrow I be able to do more than today. Do you know what that means? Today I will give the best of myself, but I hope that tomorrow I will have grown. Do you know why? So I can give even more. In other words, I expand my possibilities out of love so that my actions may be even more effective than they were today. So he says, imagine that someone you love deeply is sick at home, suddenly feeling unwell, and someone tells you, you have to rush there to help them. You don't hesitate. You go as quickly as you can, as attentively as possible so as not to have an accident along the way, all the while thinking about what you will do when you arrive. In other words, you are already using your imagination to decide quickly when you get home, not wasting any time. If possible, you are already trying to contact someone you know, perhaps a doctor, to mobilize a way to help this person. Wouldn't you give everything you have to the fullest in that moment, because you love? Now, imagine what the quality of our actions would be if everything were infused with love. The highest imagination, the greatest attention, the utmost efficiency, the fastest decision-making, discernment. Why? Because love brings a person to the very height of their possibilities. And it shouldn't be just a single moment, but all our moments should be imbued with love, so that we could sharpen our tools. All virtues are tools, so that we could learn them and use them well. That is the idea. Thus, the path of selfless action, free from selfishness and infused with love. This would be karma yoga. It would be the goal of the person who ascends the pyramid by the path of love. Now he will speak a little about wisdom, the second path. Wisdom is not about accumulating facts, but about how one responds to them internally. The example of the precious stone. Forgive me, sometimes I feel like I've told these examples so many times that you all already know them. But those who have attended one or two of my lectures, at least about 10, already know them. This is one of those examples that I really enjoy sharing. Imagine someone who sees a diamond. The way this person responds to the diamond is of the same quality as the way they respond to any event in their life. To a conflict, to a relationship, to a loss, to a gain. This is a good example. Any moment in life. It is a good example of your ability to respond to events. He says that an ordinary, ambitious man would look at it and ask, how much is it worth? What is the price? How much can I sell it for? Can I get a better price? If I sell it whole like this, or if I break it into pieces? Or if I already have enough money, what will people think of me? If I hang it around my neck, should I put it on my crown? How I will present myself? How will everyone envy me? In other words, what can I gain from this? On a material level or on a psychological level? Never forget that ambition on the psychological level is harder to deal with than ambition on the material level. Material. In other words, it is easier to help someone stop being greedy than to help them stop being excessively vain. You are dealing with more subtle planes, and ambition works the same way. It is more volatile, harder for you to perceive and master. So, the ordinary person would think in this way. And what would a wise person think upon seeing a diamond? Look at this prodigious thing. How did nature produce this? Imagine that a piece of coal and a diamond are basically made of the same thing, carbon molecules. How did nature organize these molecules in such a perfect way as to produce a marvel of beauty like this? Could this be a lesson from nature that I could apply to myself? In anything else, I am also composed of many elements. If I find a perfect harmony among them, could I not become a human diamond? Would my thoughts, my feelings, my actions not become crystalline and resilient and capable of multiplying light like a diamond? You will see that, within the Tibetan tradition, they call it Dorje. The mind of man, which is pure, solid, crystalline, and capable of multiplying light. Dorje means diamond. Vajra, in Sanskrit, means diamond. It is the diamond man. In other words, it is a symbolism well known within the traditions. So, from a stone like this, you would look at it and draw a life lesson on how to deal with yourself. Not only from this stone, but from anything at all. So, the circumstances are the same. It is the response you give to them that will show whether you are wise or not. A wise person is not someone to whom extraordinary things happen, but someone who gives extraordinary responses to the common things of life. And he always leaves that situation greater than when he entered it. So, wisdom is not the accumulation of data. He will speak a lot about this, but rather the ability to use, step by step, each lesson learned to give a more effective response to life in the next moment. Remember that passage. For those who have read something by Plato, Plato's dialogues are marvelous. There is a moment when Socrates, who is the character in all of Plato's dialogues, since Socrates himself never wrote anything, there is one of these dialogues in which Socrates is debating with a sophist, Gorgias. He was debating with, I can't recall now, Callicles. And he would turn to this Callicles and say the following, Callicles, do not run away from the dialogue. Convince us in the best way possible. Do you know why? If you convince me that this idea of yours, which I do not see now, is truer than mine, tomorrow you will find me on the street living by that idea. You are not simply playing with words, you are playing with lives. If you convince me that you are right, you will find me on the street tomorrow, living your idea, not mine. People, I find this so beautiful. Imagine what it means for a person to have the solidity and moral strength to say something like this. If you convince me that you are right, tomorrow you will find me on the street, living your idea and not mine. You are a wise person, or at least someone who seeks wisdom, a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. And this is what Sri Ram is trying to explain. Wisdom is measured by the ability to transform knowledge into a human response to life, into an appropriate response to life, at every moment, step by step. The possession of knowledge is worth nothing if it exists in a static state, addicted to comfort. To act when action is necessary. It's as if we imagine a man who has the latest model car in his garage, and when an emergency arises and he needs to do something out on the street, he goes on foot. So, when he needs the speed of that machine, he doesn't use it, doesn't know how to use it, or doesn't remember to use it. This is very similar to a man who possesses an extraordinary intellectualism. He has already read 1,000 ideas, but when it comes time to respond to the events of life, he goes on foot. In other words, he responds just like anyone else. Nor does a person who has a great deal of information necessarily respond to life in a more generous or more fraternal way. Is everyone who is well informed necessarily more virtuous? We realize that this is not the case. These are two very different things. So, this person has a powerful machine that, if used, could take him far, but when it comes time to move, he goes on foot. In other words, his life does not, in practice, reflect the amount of knowledge he has accumulated. He says, well, this is not wisdom. Sankaracharya, another very interesting Hindu sage from the Vedanta school, used to say the following, a medicine only has an effect when it is ingested, not simply when its name is spoken. It may sound amusing, but intellectualism is exactly like this. I am feeling a terrible headache. Aspirin, 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 aspirin. And yet I don't take the aspirin. I don't bring it into my life, do I? Isn't that curious? It becomes a mass of information kept only at the intellectual level. When it comes time to respond to life, like any ordinary person, he says, be careful, this is not wisdom, this is just another tool of vanity. To flaunt quantity, not quality. It is about horizontality, extension, not depth. Wisdom is depth, not extension. And what is the purpose of extension? If at none of its points do you dive in, if at none of its points do you go deeper. Life demands action, and it is our inner condition that gives meaning to that action. In other words, he is speaking of this unfolding of wisdom, which is connected to action. That is, wisdom truly becomes wisdom when you move through the world, taking it into account. Act so that I may see you, said Socrates. Move so I can see what you truly know. Respond to life so I can see what you really know. So, life demands action, and the inner condition gives meaning to action. Happiness is the flow of life on all levels. Thus, it is as if wisdom clears the way for the flow of life on the mental, emotional, and physical levels. Life flows through every action you take in the world. Thought, word, action, feeling, all flow with life. In such a way that you can notice that sometimes two people perform identical acts, yet one is filled with life and the other is not. No, you know this. One of the things we notice most is in art. A pianist is a curious example. A person plays beautifully, a prodigy, but when you listen, all you feel is vanity. Sometimes it's even a bit irritating. And perhaps someone who is not as technically gifted conveys a more elevated feeling to you. Have you never felt that? Sometimes there are certain pianists who seem like mere key strikers, while another, perhaps playing less, conveys a feeling to you. Astor Piazzolla, on one occasion, had just finished a performance and someone said to him, "Wow, that was magnificent." He is said to have replied, "Many times I play well, but only rarely do I truly make music. It is only then that I truly create music." I found that very interesting. Do you know what that means? Through playing well, I am able to convey something to those who listen to me. I touch the heart because ultimately, that is the instrument I wish to play. I touch the heart of the one who listens to me. More than 1,000 meaningless words, a single word that brings comfort to the listener is worth more, says the Buddhist Dhammapada. In other words, through things themselves, I am able to transform the world, to cast a bit of light into it. That is, my light passes through all obstacles and reaches the world. This is what it means to have performed a well-accomplished action. If not, then it is not. It is mere noise that dissipates in very little time, and this is still curious, because what is done with the heart tends, in fact, to endure longer in the world than what is not. If you go to Egypt and have the opportunity to visit a city called Akhetaten or Amarna, you will see that not a stone is left upon another, there is only desert. While others, smaller ones, such as Bubastis, for example, are still there. I find myself wondering what led a man to build something in a historical period so close to the other. And yet, one has endured almost entirely intact, while of the other, nothing remains. Historically, it is said that this is a testament to the intentions that were behind the action. Material things will never be eternal, but they pursue eternity, depending on the magnitude of the intention that gave rise to them. Thus, it is one of the witnesses to the quality of the action that flows through us on every level. It makes a difference. See how much of a difference the things Plato said are making. We are constantly evoking them. They are making a difference in our lives. He lived 2,400 years ago. What difference does it make what we said yesterday? Last week, which of our words managed to project themselves into time? Did they bring any level of light to ourselves and to those around us? And this reveals the quality of the intention that was brought forth, in other words, the level of wisdom. Eternity is a demonstration of wisdom. Even though eternity is impossible on the material plane, durability means that things are striving for eternity, because your intention was in pursuit of it. Life should flow as wisdom, guided by free intelligence and not by mere automatism. Foolishness. He goes on to say that one of the symptoms, for example, of automatism and foolishness, no matter how sophisticated it may appear, is the inability to recognize any form of greatness. Whether it is greatness in kindness, beauty, truth, or justice, it cannot be recognized. Have you ever stopped to consider, historically, how many geniuses were recognized by their contemporaries? You know that a historical study has already been conducted on this, right? Great geniuses, individuals who accomplished truly remarkable things, On average, about 80% of them went completely unrecognized by their contemporaries. And sometimes they were discriminated against, sometimes denied, sometimes attacked, and some were even killed. And many of those men who surrounded them, in fact, the majority of those who persecuted an artist, for example, were the learned men of their time. Men who, by the standards of their era, were considered cultured. But did they truly possess wisdom? A certain level, a bit of light within you, allows you to recognize what light is and to perceive it when it manifests outside yourself. If there is no light within me, well, I know things only by their labels. If it doesn't have a label, I deny it. If you watched a film that was showing quite recently in Brasilia, I don't know if you get the posters, it's called The Man Who Knew Infinity. It's beautiful. For those who haven't seen it, it's truly worth it. Ramanujan was an Indian physicist who had only a basic education in India, and he was a brilliant mathematician. To this day, his mathematical theories are still being used, and, in fact, some of his equations have yet to be understood. When he arrives at Oxford, most of the professors discriminate against him harshly. He was a semi-literate Indian. One or two look at him and see that he is a genius. In other words, what is the quality of those one or two who recognize him? They recognize a simple Indian, extremely poor, who was homeless in the city where he lived. They recognize him as a genius. Do you realize that this person must have had something, some insight, some moment of brilliance, some moment of contact with the light within themselves, in order to recognize the light outside? Because otherwise, it is mere mechanicalness that sees nothing outside. Their sense of things is extremely superficial. Just as their sense of themselves is superficial. Superficiality communicates with superficiality. Depth communicates with depth. So, the quality of being human. The capacity for discernment, because just as one does not recognize the other person, one also fails to recognize the most appropriate actions in one's own life. The right word to use with another is not simply about having discernment, because one day you might cross paths with a genius. It is about discernment because you encounter human beings all the time. And all the time you make choices, and all the time you make mistakes. The superficial person runs the risk of turning their life into a great mistake because there are choices to be made every second, and generally, they are mistaken choices. Made on the surface, without depth. The wise do not imitate others. They may be inactive at the moment. They learn, they listen, but are always ready to act appropriately. Wisdom serves the flow of life. Thus, a wise person is not someone who wishes to flaunt their wisdom to prove anything to anyone. They respond to the flow of life, and if the opportunity arises, they can indeed reveal themselves through great deeds. An example of this, for instance, is a hero. You may have heard about it, because there was a film that told and spread this story very well about that German named Schindler, who saved many Jews during World War II, putting his own life at risk. Yes, Schindler's List, a beautiful film as well. And this man put his life at risk in many ways. Many people, families, children, a great number of lives were saved by him. Now, imagine this. He was a virtuous man with the ability to put his own interests second to a humanitarian act. Then came the madness of Nazism. It was in this context that his greatness came to light. If Hitler had never existed, if Nazism had never arisen, perhaps we would never have heard of Schindler. Because he would never do anything just for the sake of being recognized. He would not act to show off before the world, to display his own greatness. He would respond to the needs that life presented in the best way possible. If there were no extraordinary needs, his actions would be ordinary. Honest, yes. Beautiful, yes. Upright, yes, but always according to what the law of necessity would require of him. He does not engage in sensationalist or exhibitionist acts. He can easily go unnoticed by humanity. He is concerned with being at peace with his own conscience. And not with having a greatness, one he himself knows he does not possess, recognized by anyone. Because the mark of the wise, do you remember Socrates? All I know is that I know nothing. It is to understand that, before the universe, his wisdom is still limited. He does not wish to flaunt an absolute knowledge, which he knows he does not possess. So, this is a characteristic. Imagine a wise person in the present moment. The only thing he would never have is popularity. Because today, popularity comes at a high price. He would never pay it. He would not pursue it. Sometimes, I have some doubts when there is too much talk about certain very popular figures. Popularity today, there may be exceptions that prove the rule, but in general, popularity today demands a very high price. In terms of conduct. Wisdom and beautiful action are always rooted in love. Now he will speak about the third characteristic, which is devotion, also a form of love. Remember, they were action, wisdom, and devotion. The three paths. Now he will follow the path of devotion. All three are related to love. And now he will say that devotion, obviously, surpasses the others. Because devotion is to devote, it is to incline oneself toward God. It is an act of love by its very nature. It is as if we recognize within ourselves divine attributes, and we draw closer to the divine through affinity. It is an inclination, a tendency toward God. He will explain how this word, much more than the other two, is often misinterpreted. In this part, he is quite stern. He will say that, many times, devotion in the West is confused with what? Fanaticism. Very often, it is one of the most misunderstood and mistreated words. So, he will say devotion is practiced without any expectation of benefit. It is motivated solely by love. Devotion without any expectation of benefit. Do you realize that things have already become complicated here? He goes even further along this line of thought. The expectation present in the devotion of most people, even if unconscious. Most people have, in quotes, devotion that is laden with expectation. Most relationships with God, he says, are filled with an expectation of return, which causes them to lose their true character as devotion. Plato used to say that what most offends the gods is not disbelief in them, but believing and thinking that they can be bought. Do you understand? In other words, it's a give and take relationship. I do certain things and receive something in return. It is said of Philo of Alexandria, who was a great writer. He wrote about the life of a wise man named Apollonius of Tyana. And Apollonius was a religious reformer. You can see that this decline has deep roots. When Apollonius lived, which was at the beginning of the Christian era, many of the world's religions were already, in many ways, quite decadent. He arrives in Egypt, and a ceremony was being held with the sacrifice of an animal. Egypt was already very decadent at that time, at the dawn of the Christian era. And it is said that he entered that Egyptian temple shouting. And he is said to have declared the following: abstain from washing your altars in blood. The only sacrifice that is desirable to the gods is the sacrifice of your animal self upon the altars of wisdom. Do you understand? What can you offer to the gods? This was a polytheistic tradition. What can you offer to the gods that they cannot obtain for themselves, being gods? There is only one thing, your evolution. Because that, they cannot obtain on their own. You have free will. They cannot force you. Your growth, as a human being, that they need from you. They will only have it if you give it to them. And this is the only offering that can be made. Anything else is useless. What else could they desire that they could not obtain for themselves? There is a prayer from a Sufi master. Just so you know, I truly appreciate this tradition. And within Sufism, there was a master named Rabi'a al-Adawiyya. Very little remains of her, but there is a prayer that I am particularly fond of. She used to say, "My Lord, my God, if I seek you out of fear of your hell, burn me in your hell. If I seek you out of desire for your heaven, cast me out of your heaven. It is you whom I seek. Only for who you are, receive me into the embrace of your glory. For who you are, in you there is goodness, justice, and in me as well. I am similar. Therefore, we are of the same nature, and I am drawn to you. Why is that? Because I wish to become ever more alike, to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. In other words, I draw near out of affinity for who you are and for who I am, and not because I might gain or lose something from it. That would be true devotion. To be drawn toward God is a magnetism of affinity without any self-interest, but simply because God is God and I am human. That would be true devotion. Anything else, anything horizontal, means give and take. It's a transaction, a game. The worst thing is to believe in him and think that he can be bought. In truth, faith and devotion would be very similar, because faith comes from fides, which is the same root as confides, meaning trust. In other words, it is a bond of recognition, not a bond of expectation. There is no reason to have expectations. God already is what he must be. And the fact that I become what I must be depends on my own effort, not on expectations. So, there is no expectation of gain or loss in this. Sometimes, what we have is a relationship of, let's say, good friends, good neighbors. I am protected, I follow certain precepts, but each one in their own world, living according to completely different principles. Me, in my own way, and God in his. This is neither faith nor devotion, according to the concept that Sri Ram is defending. There is no relationship of nature, no intimate bond of recognition. There is a play of interests. Surrender does not allow for me with reservations or demands. Surrender is the search for the path, because this is what befits me as a human being, and not because I will gain or lose something from it, or because I fear or desire. If you imagine, for example, Ramanujan, that mathematician we were talking about a little while ago. He loved mathematics, and he had a terrible fear of dying without revealing to the world the equations he had seen, because he truly saw them. He said that his goddess communicated them to him, mathematical equations. He had a tremendous love and wanted to share with the world the equations he had discovered. Can you imagine Ramanujan asking mathematics to give him something in return? To protect him from something? Or to give him some benefit? No. Her gift was her very existence and his ability to see her. He asked for nothing. Can you imagine, I don't know, Mozart asking music to give him something other than itself? No. Protect me. Give me some benefit? No. It gives nothing else but to be itself and to allow me to see it. Do you realize that these are paths of vision, of attributes, of God? It is a form of devotion. So, this is exactly the idea he is trying to convey. Devotion leaves nothing outside of itself as a claim. Total renunciation of the engines of the small I, before love or devotion blossom in glory and beauty. Total renunciation of the motivations, the engines of the small I. Remember when we talked about change, about motivations? We do not speak of it. I love, for there is no I as a giver outside of love. I love means an I and love. No, I and love are one and the same. I do not wish to gain anything from this. There is no I outside of love. There is no attribute of mine that I recognize as myself more than love. Thoughts, feelings, body, all are tools. I am love, so it is not that I love. Love is who I am. In love, there is a deeper identity, and it is enough for me. It is justified in itself. This is Platonic love. Plato speaks about this. True love justifies itself. The identity of humanity should be rooted there. There is nothing outside of this. Therefore, there is nothing to be gratified by. The very act of loving already contains its own gratification. Who will serve God in exchange for nothing? He quotes, this is a biblical passage, in exchange for nothing, without trade, for the sake of service itself, finding fulfillment in the very act of serving. To serve God through his attributes. "Take refuge in me," says the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says to Arjuna, "Take refuge in me." That is, find your identity and my deepest attributes, and then you will be well. Then you will find the sleep of the just, the wakefulness of the just, the life of the just, happiness, fulfillment, and peace. There is no beneficiary outside. There is no one winning or losing. Nothing remains of me except that which I give. Beyond my devotion, there is nothing else, and I find fulfillment in this. The great bishops throughout history have always spoken much about this. Krishna, in that same work, the Bhagavad Gita, says, "The devotee is the same toward friend and enemy, in honor and in dishonor. All that is most beautiful blossoms within him. Nothing is sought, everything flows forth, everything is given in every moment." That is, each moment, like that Sufi I mentioned to you earlier, now. At every moment, I seek the rope, that which I need to be human. Now, I seek compassion, I seek fraternity. And when I find this potential within myself, that moment is complete. Nothing is lacking, nor is anything in excess, for it to make me happy. I expect nothing beyond fulfilling myself as a human being. This is fullness. I am the complete sage. You might ask, but how do we reach this? It is a process of exchange. Philosophy is the pursuit of this. It is the pursuit of wisdom. A slow process of exchange, where you gradually refine your taste. And you also learn to savor virtues, just as you savor sensations. To find flavor in justice, just as we do in physical accomplishment. And by exchanging, you continually elevate your consciousness. Using every opportunity and creating opportunities so that your taste becomes more refined. And learning to love higher things. And learning to find fulfillment in higher things. This would be the process of life. This phrase comes from Sri Ram himself. Evolution is nothing more than the refinement of taste. To learn to find a degree of happiness and fulfillment in subtle and more human things, rather than merely in material things, which you will inevitably lose. What is truly yours, nothing and no one can take from you. And most of the things that fulfill us are things that we will inevitably lose. And from this comes fear, from this comes anxiety. From this comes a great part of our unhappiness. The sacred image can blossom from the purity of the heart and can be identified as an inspiring image of a master or a divinity. So, let's say that you are someone who, at this moment, misses a bit of peace the most. Perhaps a historical figure who possesses divine attributes but whose main quality is peace inspires you more. And you begin to set this as your goal. For example, he speaks about the Buddhist tradition. One of the main things that the figure of Shakyamuni Gautama, the Buddha, conveys is the idea of peace. So, this person is a devotee of Buddha, but deep down, he is a devotee of peace through Buddha. Isn't this a form of personalistic worship? Because if he starts to worship a personality, he begins to make exchanges. Let's say what I need most is love. I have a lot of difficulty giving my heart to people. So I choose a historical figure who embodies this, such as Jesus Christ. And I relate to and have devotion for him, but through Jesus Christ, my devotion is to love, which is an attribute of unity. It is not a cult of personality. It is not the worship of a character. He simply evokes this within me. I do not invoke him to come down and solve my problems. He evokes within me, through this image, what I have that is best. I elevate myself toward him. He inspires in me something abstract, which is the direction toward which he points. It is not a cult of personality, no matter who it may be. He says that those who are devoted in this way would recognize the other. There would be no discrimination. No one who is devoted to Buddha would discriminate against someone devoted to Jesus Christ, or vice versa, if they understood that true devotion is to the attributes of unity. And not for an image that may embody it very well, but is still an image limited by time and space. Do you understand this? And he says, look, when this stops, in the image, it can give rise to a cult of personality, which can lead to a series of complicated consequences. For example, discrimination, prejudice, fanaticism, and many other things. And, logically, these beings came so that we could see through them, so that we could perceive unity. Liberated beings can share influence, beauty, and power in an incomparable way. They bring benefit wherever they go. Plato used to say, "The best thing you can do for those you love is to grow." Only in this way can you truly guarantee anything for them, because, in truth, those who benefit others the most are those who grow, who fulfill their purpose, who develop as human beings. They attain light and leave behind a path of light. This is the greatest legacy a person can leave in the world. Anything else is very fleeting. Throughout this discussion, we have been speaking about people who did not leave behind material things, but rather left behind light, because this is a legacy that endures through time. It is interesting because we live in a historical moment where people seem to be considered great by the amount of things they possess. But history is relentless. It reveals what true greatness is. People are truly great by the amount they give. The greatness of generosity reflects the true stature of a person, not the greatness of possessions. Who was wealthy in the 2nd century before Christ? Does anyone know? But those who were wise, we remember, like Plato. Human beings become great through what they are able to give, not through what they are able to keep for themselves. This is yet another misconception of our historical moment. It is possible to live pure altruism without ceasing to be present in the world. I really like this image because it gave me the idea of the flower blossoming at a higher level, in a higher tone. In other words, this phrase, which comes from Tibetan masters, "Come from your world to ours." They are not telling you to leave SQS. 408, block I don't know what, stay where you are, but at a higher level of consciousness. That is what it means to come from your world to ours. It is not about leaving the world, it is not about dying, it is not about losing the physical body, but simply about your consciousness vibrating at a higher level. Those who have already attended the lecture on the Kybalion, and those who will read it next year, this book with us, will see that the Egyptian conception is that the universe, your inner name is. It is a vibration. The universe differentiates itself through vibrations. From the coarsest vibration of matter to the most subtle vibration of spirit. And if you wish to evolve, you accelerate and refine your vibration. Your inner name is the level at which you vibrate. This vibration, this inner name, means you may be in the same physical place, but you have stopped vibrating here and are now vibrating there. The body has not moved, but your consciousness has become more subtle. That is why, in the Indian tradition, for example, mantras, which are said to be the inner names of the gods, were a form of vibration. They had no value whatsoever if they were not pronounced with the exact vibration, because the vibration was the name of a divine being. In the time when we still knew what that was, because today it is something completely exotic, we no longer have as much sensitivity in this area. But what they sought was precisely this, a vibration that was exactly the inner name of a being. That could allow me to draw closer to it. So, come from your world to ours means to remain in the same physical place, but to ascend metaphysically. In fact, Roger Scruton, who is a philosopher still living today, very interesting, an Englishman, he says, we can be contemporaries of people sharing the same physical space, but not coevals, that is, not vibrating on the same dimension, but above. This is the best we can do for them. And, in this sense, he is echoing Plato, who said the same thing. The path is transmutation, the emergence of a new being, and not merely the modification of the old. Moments of beauty and happiness are proof that this nature exists potentially within humanity. So, he says, the best way for you to believe in yourself is to remember those golden moments. That moment when you helped someone without any interest in being seen, in promoting your own name, without telling anyone, without later feeling proud, not even to yourself. You simply did it because you felt it was your duty. If you were able to do this even once in your life, that is a seed. And from that seed can grow the tree of righteousness, the tree of wisdom, the tree of true devotion. If even once in my life I was capable of a love where I am certain that I channeled and gave everything best within me, once is a seed, a sign that this tree can be born. Because, in truth, human nature is not the transformation of what we are now. It is the emergence of something absolutely new that lies dormant within us, a seed. That is why it is necessary to identify this mystery, those rare moments when it appeared. Because where there is a seed, one day there will be a tree, leaves, and fruit. Buddha said this, he spoke, that which will be must find its roots in the present. That which is, must find its seeds in the past. You cannot have something come to fruition unless it was already present in potential from the very beginning. So the potential of the human condition in its purest form is something we should be seeking within our lives and collecting like a jewel, because these are the most precious things we possess. When Gibran, in his book The Prophet, speaks about dwellings, he says this, "What do you keep? Why do you lock the doors of your dwelling so tightly? What do you have inside that is so precious? Do you possess golden fraternity? Do you possess precious wisdom? If you have none of these, what are you keeping safe? Do you understand? To place in a golden vault of memories that moment when I was truly human, because that is the moment to which my consciousness should always return whenever I am in doubt. And that is where I should direct myself whenever I wonder where I want to go with all of this. To develop this, to let it blossom. Because if this is present for even a minute in the current moment, it means that one day it will be complete. I need to know, when someone asks you, who are you? Your memory must return to this, to those few seeds that are kept inside a golden box in our memory. And finally, consciousness in its pure and original state, identified with the world, even though within a particular body, this union is the highest goal of humanity. If we begin to recognize this similarity that connects us to the unity of values, virtues, and wisdom, if we identify with it and work to develop this human nature that exists in potential within us. In the end, what you call life will be summed up by the success you achieved in your task. The rest are just footsteps in circles on the sand. Nothing more. The wind quickly sweeps them away, no matter how many those steps may have been. Not long ago, we had Steve Jobs among us, a brilliant individual who created things that changed our historical moment. He passed away a year later, and by the next Apple conference, almost everything he had created had already been surpassed, improved upon, and new things had been developed, let's say, with even more features and advancements. Today, there are already countless products with even more features. Right? So, what is truly lasting in the work of someone who produces only in terms of quantity, no matter how well-intentioned they may be? Very soon after, it amounts to nothing because it never truly was anything. It is an illusion. And not out of vanity or self-interest, but out of a sense of duty. We should strive to leave the world a little better than we found it, and give others the opportunity to grow through our actions. This is what human life truly comes down to. This is the true essence of being human, of being a person. And this is something we should always remember. This is the conception of Sri Ran, and particularly I am giving this talk to you because I find it very beautiful and I agree, I consider it very valid. We should always return to this point and remind ourselves of what we are doing here. Well, that's it for today. I want to sincerely apologize, as I am aware that some of you have other commitments and classes to attend after this. Thank you all for your attention and understanding, and I appreciate your patience.